distinguished fellow panelist, Dr. Kaushik Basu, Dr. Sergey Suarez, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to recognize my colleague, the UN Resident Coordinator in Brazil and UNDP Resident Representative, Dr. Jorge Chediek, the Director of the Rio Plus Center, Dr. Romulo Paes de Sousa. Thank you. I'm obviously delighted and inspired to be with you today in this first international seminar on a world without poverty. Let me first thank our colleagues and partners at the World Bank, at the Ministry for Social Development and Fight Against Hunger, the Government of Brazil, the Brazilian Institute of Applied Economic Research. Slower. It's not working. I should wait a little bit. Are we good? Thank you. So I was thanking the partners. You want to lift it? Okay. Is that good? I'm shorter than you think. So let me thank the partners for co-organizing this event together with UNDP's International Policy Center for Inclusive Growth, the IPC, and with the support of the Rio Mais Center. We are very pleased to be part of the Brazil Learning Initiative for a World Without Poverty. My remarks today are structured around different dimensions of the question, is a world without poverty possible? A very short speech would be to say, yes, it is possible within our generation, learn from Brazil. But probably the audience would like to hear a little more and deserves more detail. As we all know, the world has reached already the MDG target of halving the proportion of people living in extreme poverty, living on less than the famous poverty line, the monetary poverty line of $1.25 a day, 5 years ahead of the 2015 deadline. So a world without poverty is not only possible, but within reach. However, this aggregate analysis can be deeply misleading. China, India, Brazil, Mexico, and the prosperous rise of some African nation contrast with the rest of Africa, with the rest of Southern Asia, with close to half of its population still extreme poor. China and other countries in East and South Asia have been the major driver in reducing the aggregate global poverty rate. Brazil has been part of that locomotive of reduction of poverty. But even in China, a low extreme poverty rate of 6.3% still translates into more than 84 million people living in abject destitution. This is almost twice the population of the state of Sao Paulo. The heterogeneous rate in poverty reduction is not an original point and may even seem trivial, but I want to emphasize it because to eradicate poverty, it is not enough to just extrapolate global aggregate trends. This is the tyranny of the averages, the tyranny of the statistics. We need to understand why close to 1 billion people have been left out of the processes that brought many millions, that lifted many millions above the poverty line. Many of those that still live in poverty today are part of marginalized groups without rights that have seen their country's progress pass by them, pass before them, happen in their sight, in plain daylight. Often in context of low social cohesion, suffering from political and economic exclusion. To eradicate this kind of poverty, we need to deal with what I call the challenge of reaching the last mile, or the suggestion of getting down to zero in a very Brazilian public policy expression that has now become currency in the universal development discourse. This is a complex task, and I will come to it later in more detail, but it is important to note that the last mile exists both in the remote rural areas where it was invented, as well as within cities where the mile is a figure of speech, is figurative, but nevertheless is a hard fact. By 2012, nearly 1/3 of urban residents in developing regions still lived in slums with inadequate access to basic services, housing, security, and livelihoods. Latin America is a case in point in terms of infrahuman living conditions in urban settings. Due in part to the fast pace of urbanization, the number of people living in slum conditions is not decreasing, it is growing. People also remain poor or are thrown back into poverty because of conflicts, natural disasters, or some other shocks, with families and communities just unable to cope with. That is why we need a dynamic perspective on poverty. Shocks like conflict and disasters that overwhelm national capacities to respond can drive setbacks even in countries that have made progress. Let me mention the current Ebola outbreak. I will come back to it in Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone, even possibly in Mali. I recently went to the 3 countries to help repurpose the UN programs, the UN country programs, and have seen firsthand the devastating impact of this shock on people's lives, but also the devastating impact on the fight, on the valiant fight of the 3 governments against poverty, the shock on the economy. Ebola will erase the gains of peace and development for 1 generation or more if we don't help. We're currently witnessing multiple refugee crises due to conflicts in Central African Republic, in Democratic Republic of Congo, in Mali, in Syria and the neighboring countries, the border area between South Sudan and Sudan, among many others. The number of newly displaced persons, both cross-border refugees and internally displaced persons, the new poor, has tripled since 2010, reaching a record high of 51 million by the end of 2013. These crises create major obstacles for development and the fight against poverty. And again, I will elaborate more on this challenge, but I would like to note that it calls for a resilience approach to poverty reduction. In other words, risk-informed development. In the remainder of my remarks, I will ask 2 questions. First, like Dr. Basu, what do we mean by a world without poverty? And second, how does development get us there? How is development useful to bringing about such a world? We need to go beyond income poverty when thinking about poverty in itself. Deprivation is more than just the lack of income. The development agenda is not just about ensuring that basic needs are met. It is fundamentally about how to ensure that people's aspirations are met. As Mahbubul Haq put it, the objective of development is to create an enabling environment for people to enjoy long, healthy, and creative lives. At UNDP, this human development approach underlies all our work. People need decent jobs, greater access to information and knowledge, better health services, more educated political participation, more secure livelihoods, security against crime and physical violence, political and cultural freedoms and opportunities to participate in community activities. All that has to do with poverty. Women need equality, minorities respect, the planet needs protection, and the world demands peace. All of these things are important in their own right. They are ends to be achieved, but they are also instrumental to achieve a world without income poverty everywhere and all the time. This is the message that has emerged loud and clear from the global conversation on the post-2015 development agenda. A world without poverty, broadly understood, is challenging but achievable. However, it requires a fundamentally new approach in the post-MDG era. Let me first reflect on the approach that dominated the MDG thinking. The foundation for much of the thinking and action on development cooperation over the last decade and a half was dominated by the pursuit of an agenda which resulted from the Millennium Declaration and the UN conferences in the preceding decade. This agenda was based on a compact between developed and developing nations, developing countries committed to a set of goals, MDGs 1 to 7, and to improving governance, while developed countries committed to making resources and opportunities available to enable developing countries to achieve those goals, typically crystallized in MDG 8. with their clear and simple call to tackle extreme poverty and hunger, advance health, gender equality, and women's empowerment, the MDGs have helped mobilize resources and concentrate action, focus action on development around the world. Many developing countries integrated the MDGs in their development plans and poverty reduction strategy papers, and pursued very deliberate strategies to achieve these goals and mobilize external support around them. And external support came. The MDGs also fostered increased knowledge and capacity and the strengthening of statistical systems at both national and international levels to enable the production of quality data for monitoring purposes, to know what progress had been achieved, condition of accountability and transparency, but also a necessary condition to know when public policies were getting us nowhere. But the framing of the MDGs was informed by and reinforced the duality between developed and developing countries that dominated perceptions of development cooperation at the turn of the century and for much time before then. It also saw development cooperation as a rather narrow assistance-like endeavor, similar to social transfers at the national level, where money flows from those better off, from the higher classes, to those that are poor. If we want to achieve a world without poverty by 2030, we need a new approach to development. This new approach should be cognizant of fundamental structural changes. A multipolar world. We all know that today the duality between developed and developing countries is not neat, if at all current anymore. Emerging economies do not see themselves fitting in either group and have sharp differences amongst each other. South-South cooperation, concessional loans, grants, debt relief, and technical cooperation is estimated at 10% of the total development cooperation only a couple of years back. Going forward, this requires widening the world's donor base. We need global actors who take on global responsibilities, who can have seats at the development effectiveness table, not only as donors, but mostly as partners. The role of the South goes certainly beyond resources. Ideas and policies from the South, from Southern governments and Southern societies, are an essential contribution to development. Many developing countries, and even developed countries, would have a lot to gain from the recent experience here in Brazil in reducing both poverty and inequality in a multicultural, democratic society that has overcome decades of social and political exclusion. The International Policy Center for Inclusive Growth has been playing a fundamental role in sharing this experience. With the support of the government of Brazil, a distinctive feature of the IPC has been that it takes an approach grounded by the experience and needs of the developing countries. The Rio Mais Center for Sustainable Development, based in Rio de Janeiro, is another relevant example and has been set up as one of UNDP's global policy centers to contribute with ideas and actions to advance a sustainable development agenda, particularly from the Global South perspective. Both, and of course IPEA, are the kind of institutions that are needed to take full advantage of the potential of the South as a source of ideas and policies for development. Let me talk a minute about a more demanding financing context. Ideas are key, but financing helps. And we can no longer think of development financing need as a gap to be filled. There are growing pressures to have additional aid more narrowly focused on either very poor or fragile countries or countries that are both. At the same time, a larger set of issues beyond financing development cooperation is emerging. The need for international action and financing on issues ranging from climate change to communicable disease control to transnational crime and terrorism is clear. International cooperation beyond development cooperation needs financing. Amidst this new reality, there is an ongoing debate around the definition of official development assistance, ODA. Some donors would like to widen the concept of ODA to include military, rule of law, judicial, human rights, and security sector cooperation. We also witness a dialectic debate between having peaceful and inclusive societies in the Sustainable Development Goals, Goal 16, in the Open Working Group proposal, and maintaining the normative definition of ODA. In this context, two things are important. First, to ensure that there is clarity on what is included in ODA. What can we count when we say this is development cooperation? Second, to ensure that if there are any changes in the definition of ODA, then we inflate the current measures and accompany them by a proper upward adjustment of the 0.7% of the gross product target to which traditional donors have committed. What do we need to do in practice to get to a world without poverty where development aspirations are met? In practice, there are three streams of action that are required. Building resilience is the first. The challenge of eradicating poverty is to eradicate it in countries where natural disasters, conflict, instability, weak governance and institutions, and little rule of law underpin it every day. The geography of fragility is a hard terrain to fight poverty. At the same time, the challenge is not just to lift people out of poverty. It is to ensure that their escape from poverty is permanent, is stable. We know that in the absence of social protection, people just above the poverty line face increased risks of falling below it, or those in poverty face being trapped in it for generations and transmitting it to their children. Accordingly, comprehensive social protection programs will remain key. In this context, I would like to publicly commend Brazil's Bolsa Familia program, which is one of the most notable examples of how well-designed social protection programs can be effective in reducing poverty and avoiding intergenerational fatality and addressing inequalities at the same time. Brazil's experience also sheds light on the old debate between transfers and jobs in reducing poverty. Brazil was able to achieve a good balance between effective transfer mechanisms and expanding employment opportunities. This shows that there is not necessarily a trade-off between providing social protection and achieving job-rich growth, and that actually the two might be self-reinforcing, especially when transfers come along with better health and education outcomes contributing to growth. In sum, stronger investments in resilience have a payoff in more robust and solid growth. However, in many countries, development progress remains vulnerable to volatility and shocks, including economic shocks, conflict, natural disasters, and the spread of communicable diseases. The impacts of these shocks are even more severe when governance processes are not effective in delivering services to the poor and excluded. Ebola has been described as the health crisis of poverty. Building on our experience through the partnership with the Global Fund to fight HIV, tuberculosis, and malaria, we are now at the forefront of supporting West African countries dealing with Ebola. We focus our support on coordination and delivery of essential services, including support to the health and justice sectors, community engagement, including a focus on the needs of women, and early recovery of the economy. Building resilience is fundamental to sustaining human development. It is a transformative process with the potential to strengthen the capacity of people and their communities, countries, and institutions to anticipate, prevent, recover from, and transform in the aftermath of shocks, stresses, and change. Following the end of the Khmer Rouge regime, Cambodia faced monumental challenges. Millions of people displaced, infrastructure shattered, institutional capacities virtually destroyed. As Cambodia rebuilt, UNDP provided support, focusing efforts, among others, on promoting reconciliation and building peace, the infrastructure for peace, participatory local development, and strengthening institutions from the national to the local level. Cambodia is now considered one of the fastest growing economies unmatched by any other post-conflict society, also with an annual average growth rate in Human Development Index of about 1.7%. It is possible to build back better. A world without poverty and deprivation also means addressing the hardest to reach groups, the last mile that I mentioned at the outset of my remarks. The getting to zero challenge. The imperative of leaving no one behind now and in the future requires inequality to be addressed. Overall, the next Global Development Agenda, the post-2015 goals, need to address the significant problem of inequality which has stood in the way of reaching some of the MDG targets. More than 75% of the population in developing countries live in societies which are more unequal than they were 2 decades ago with their parents. The richest 8% of the world's population earns half of the world's total income, leaving the other half for the remaining 92% of people, for the rest of us. Growing or high income inequality is detrimental to economic growth, in particular to poverty-reducing growth. High levels of inequality also undermine social cohesion and increase political and social tension, resulting in instability and conflict. For these reasons, tackling inequalities has both an intrinsic value and important practical immediate benefits. In our recent report, Humanity Divided, we stressed that inequality cannot be effectively confronted unless the inextricable links between inequality of outcomes and inequality of opportunities are taken into account. Many factors, such as cultural barriers, geographic isolation, lack of infrastructure, generations of underinvestment, biased institutions or legal systems, social norms, or living in fragile or conflict-affected areas can prevent people escape poverty and deprivation and keep them trapped there. Our recent human development reports, 2011 and 2013, examined the impact of different environmental scenarios on poverty. Looking at ensuring sustainability, we also looked at the Human Development Index and the number of people living in extreme poverty. Under a severe environmental disaster scenario, which envisions vast deforestation and land degradation, dramatic declines in biodiversity and accelerated extreme weather events, lack of water in large segments of the population, the global Human Development Index value for 2050 would fall 15% below that under the baseline scenario, 22% below in South Asia and 24% below in sub-Saharan Africa, effectively halting or even reversing decades of human development progress in both regions. Some 2.7 billion more people would live in extreme poverty under the environmental disaster scenario. I am mentioning this because, yes, poverty reduction, poverty eradication, poverty elimination is in our reach, but it is equally in our reach to face a much grimmer scenario of poverty increase. This is a consequence of two interrelated factors. First, environmental degradation would increase the number of people in extreme poverty by about 2 billion. But second, environmental calamities would keep some 800 million poor people from rising out of extreme poverty as they would otherwise have done under the base case scenario. These simulations stress that consequences of environmental threats for poverty eradication and human development are very high. The longer action is delayed, the higher the cost will be. Hence, addressing environmental degradation, including climate change, is critical for poverty reduction and for the promotion of inclusive and sustainable human development. Environmental degradation also exacerbates inequalities. Many of the world's poor live in coastal zones susceptible to storms and rising sea levels, on farmlands which are increasingly vulnerable to drought, or on hillsides prone to landslides. They rely disproportionately on the goods and services provided by nature for their income, livelihoods, food, water, and fuel. This leaves them highly vulnerable to the effects of ecosystems degradation. Women are particularly vulnerable, since their livelihoods are often directly dependent on the natural environment, for example, as primary water and fuel wood collectors. However, precisely these same societal roles that make women more vulnerable also make them key actors for driving environmental and development change. In conclusion, We need tools to support countries to chart their development paths. We need financing to implement the required actions, and we need an accountability framework that tells us about progress and what more needs to be done and by whom. On tools, given the broad formulation on the proposed Sustainable Development Goals, we will need to help developing countries with the challenge of meeting a large range of targets. Each country will have to develop a policy pathway identifying the most appropriate sequence of interventions and investments given its level of development, endowments, and national aspirations. Second, on financing, we need to consider the broader international public finance and also mobilize the huge private resources that today are sitting idle. Philanthropy and corporate social responsibility will only go as far, and the challenge will be to align incentives for profit-driven investment decisions with meeting the social and democratic aspirations of the post-2015 agenda. This can be achieved through regulatory reforms that, for instance, put an incentive on the protection of global public goods and a price on global public bads, such as pollution, including greenhouse gases. The third International Conference on Financing for Development, scheduled for next July in Addis Ababa, can be a key moment in taking these issues forward. Finally, an accountability framework that engages citizens and civil society is needed. This was the spirit of the Rio Dialogues, further expanded with the My World consultation, whereby the voices of millions of people were heard as the post-2015 agenda was being formulated. These processes can now be reshaped to help the world to hold itself to account for the commitments it will make when the SDGs are adopted. With these three elements, I believe that truly a world without poverty by 2030 can and will be achieved. Just like with the end of slavery, the economic benefit will never be the driving force. It will be the moral imperatives of dignity and solidarity, of equality, sustainability, and freedom what will lead us to a world where the destitution of poverty is an abject recollection of a difficult past, a bad nightmare that the children of our children will read about in their school books and ask us, how was this possible? Hopefully, they will also recognize us as the generation who had the courage to put an end to the nightmare. Thank you very much.